what we're going to do now is have a little think about ethics in the ethics of treatment, in the ethics of treatment in the intersection with detention under the Mental Health Act. When you're detained as a civil patient, so this is not looking at the forensic sections of the Act, rather thinking about it from a civil perspective, although I guess from a philosophical perspective, some of the issues that we're going to talk about are similar, whether you're forensically detained or civilly detained. So it's a huge area, ethics in the Mental Health Act. We're particularly going to think about one little bit of ethics and philosophy, that's epistemology. So we're going to think about some of the imbalances that the Mental Health Act might cause. And the reason for talking about this is that hopefully it's interesting. Probably, unless you've done philosophy papers, something you haven't particularly thought about. And I hope it'll have some sort of practical utility in terms of thinking about your future practice, no matter where that may end up. So what we're going to do is focus just a little bit on psychiatric interaction. And the reason for doing that is so we can have a think about what is going on and what that means from a kind of an ethical perspective, particularly when we think about knowledge. We're going to think a little bit about some of the ways that epistemology has been written about that are of relevance when we think about mental health legislation. So we're going to think about the concept of epistemic injustice. We're going to think about the concept of epistemic quietening and smothering and epistemic silencing. We're going to see how mental health legislation apply into those, and then think a little bit about the practical takeaways from this. You'll see occasionally I glance to the right. It's because I have notes for myself. This can get a bit complicated, trying to keep it relatively straightforward. Yet again, this is me. I'm not going to dwell on this, but yeah, I do a bunch of cannabis research as well. Not that it has much relevance to this particular talk. So let's just think, and I always think it's a good place to start when you think about the Mental Health Act, or in fact any legislation when it applies to psychiatry, is with what goes on with the patient in the room. And so what is actually happening there is a transfer of knowledge. Ideally, you have the patient providing knowledge to the clinician, psychiatrist, who then takes that knowledge and combines it with their own knowledge in order to, together, work out the best path forward for the patient who is seeing the psychiatrist. So that's an epistemic interaction. It's the sharing of knowledge for hopefully an epistemic gain, actually on both sides, in both the psychiatrist and the patient, although the focus on improvement certainly lies predominantly with the patient. And I guess what we need to see or think about there is that we're making an epistemic claim of what is going on, and that exists within our social context. So when we think about mental health legislation, we can see that the social context when the Mental Health Act first came into act in 1992 is not the same social context as today. And so some legislation, like mental health legislation, they talk about it having a lifespan. 30 years is a common number that's used for mental health legislation. And the reason for that is that the social context has changed. And so if we're going to understand epistemic claims about the interaction that is occurring within those two people, we do need to understand the broad social structures. Having said that, we make some assumptions about that epistemic interaction, and that includes things like the bidirectionality of trust, although it's worthwhile recognizing in some of the documents that are written that essentially control those interactions, what we tend to talk about is the rights that patients have and the responsibilities doctors have. So that certainly doesn't suggest a balance there. We also tend to focus very heavily on the individual interaction, and by doing so, we ignore the broader social context that might be very important. Of course, the kind of ethics outcome of that is we tend to think about principalism, and if you don't know anything about principalism, go read the Wikipedia page. And particularly, we think about autonomy, and certainly over the last 30 years, we've essentially seen autonomy rise in terms of its ethical importance, at the cost of other ethical principles. But engaged within those and implied by them are some of the kind of the rules around those interactions. So we don't talk so much, but expect patients to fulfill this concept of a sick role. So this was first written about by Talcott Parsons in the mid-50s. And he talked about some of the ways that being in the sick role abrogated you from your social responsibilities. And 30 years later, McKennick spent a lot of time writing about illness behaviors, the things that patients are expected to essentially do in order to show us they are sick. So the knowledge transfer that is occurring actually requires some sort of social acceptance of role, particularly by patients is where the focus has been, but also by doctors and what they bring to those interactions. All right. So what does that mean when we think about the Mental Health Act? Well, one way we can think about the Mental Health Act is as a form of socially sanctioned epistemic process. So what the Mental Health Act does in its civil sections is it provides a structured mechanism whereby the mental health system, under the auspices of the responsible clinician, commonly a psychiatrist, but can be a nurse practitioner, engage with a patient in order to make an assessment about whether that patient is requiring of treatment. So it is a socially sanctioned and indeed required interaction between patient and doctor, but there's no suggestion at any point of consideration of capacity. And capacity infers autonomy. So already the Mental Health Act is stepping away from some of those fundamental concepts of principalism, and particularly autonomy, which is generally considered to be the most important principle at the moment. Although Beecham and Childress, who are the authors of principalism, are very clear that no one principle trumps the other, if you'll pardon my turn of phrase. The other interesting thing from an epistemic perspective about mental health legislation is that it imbues knowledge within the psychiatrist and then gives them a mechanism to use that. And the inference there is that it will be used. And so if we think about what that means, it seems to immediately create a sort of imbalance epistemically, or a type of prejudice on the knowledge. So unlike that, the epistemic process I talked about initially between the patient and the doctor sharing knowledge, this makes assumptions about the doctor having a set of knowledge, which they will then apply, and that knowledge is based on the wider societal knowledge. So certainly in much of the literature, I'm not talking about mental health legislation, but talking about epistemic injustice, they talk about the doctor or the actor as being a type of interlocutor for society. And you can kind of see how this becomes problematic pretty quickly from both an ethics as well as philosophical perspective. And so to kind of make it real, let's think very quickly, say about a mum who's worried about their suicidal child, completes an 8A, brings them into the emergency department, and 8B is completed and they're asked to see me. So we can see what has actually happened is we've created an epistemic imbalance or a prejudice where the knowledge of the mother, not the patient, has now led to a structural process, an epistemic process, a process of knowledge sharing that imbues me, the psychiatrist, with power to make some decisions about the suicidal person. So right from the outset, that means it's doing things like depersonalizing or dehumanizing the patient by the mechanisms which are written into the Act. And we can see as an example how ethically shaky that may in fact be. So we do need to think about the kind of ethics and philosophy behind some of the way legislation is written there, and what that means when we think about how that legislation functions. So let's just step aside from the Act for 1 second to think a little harder about epistemology. So it's been a branch of philosophy and the knowledge of knowing for a long time. So Miranda Fricker is a philosopher who essentially was interested in the power imbalances between men and women and wrote this very interesting book called Epistemic Injustice. I'd encourage you all to read it. And she talks about two forms of epistemic injustice. The most relevant for us is this idea of what she calls testamentary epistemic injustice. So this is something about the testament, the knowledge of a person and knower, which is not heard, and the problems that can cause. Fricker talks about two forms of epistemic injustice, a sort of trivial form where this occurs in a one-off fashion. And although it may be relevant, there may be lots of countervailing reasons why that's appropriate or is okay. And then she talks about structural epistemic injustice, which clearly is not okay and means that we have societal structures built in a way that deliberately and systematically lead to problems in the sharing of knowledge. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that a piece of legislation is by its very nature structural. And because it is pervasive, it leads to problems. So when we think about epistemic injustice in relation to the Mental Health Act, some of the knowledge harms, the epistemic harms it can cause, are very clearly the knower, the patient. The risk is the knower will not be heard. There's clearly a problem, an epistemic problem here for the interlocutor or the doctor who has no capacity or has a diminished capacity for the knower's knowledge to be heard, to improve their own knowledge. Adding to that, there is the problem about the beliefs the knower has about society and how they will grow and change over time. And finally, a broader concern that's raised about society growing and recognising the loss of knowledge that may occur. So there are some epistemic problems that are written about that this form of injustice can lead to. There are also, in our particular situation as doctor and patient, some moral harms that include, as we've already mentioned briefly, the dehumanisation of the knower, who essentially seems to be kind of overlooked in the structural process itself, as well as an unjust kind of influence and support for the power differentials that lie between doctor and patient. And they also can lead to some problems when we think about the very purpose of the interview itself. I mean, unsurprisingly, that can lead to a form of moral distress in doctors, because fundamentally we want to do good things for patients. And when we find ourselves, even if we can't articulate it, in this position where we're kind of doing things that either feel wrong to us or we know might be wrong, but feel like we have no option but to, that clearly can be a distressing situation, which you kind of feel like an interlocutor you've been put into by society, or in this case, the law. It's worth taking these notions, I think, and just pushing them a little bit further to help you think about, how else they might be affecting what's going on. And so these notions have really been grown over the last decade or so by Christine Dotson. She's a philosopher in the US, and she's mostly interested in what is going on philosophically and epistemically in violence towards Black women, mostly by Black men. And many of the notions have come out of her writing in that area, although it's clear to see that these notions also have some influence to us. So she talks about epistemic quieting and epistemic smothering as forms of epistemic injustice. So smothering is a kind of the problem occurs when the audience, that's us, she politely describes out of ignorance, don't realise that they're missing on understanding the knowledge that's coming their way. Fricker might call this a form of heroistic epistemic injustice, and so she's concerned about the loss of knowledge by this ignorance. And epistemic quietening is when the knower, in our case the patient, simply stops sharing knowledge, the reason for which being is they have such a poor view of how that knowledge will be received. So Christine Dotson talks about that in terms of Black women not sharing knowledge with police. In our view, it's pretty clear that if you've had some interactions with mental health services, you feel like those have gone badly, or you have been coerced, or you've been dehumanized, it doesn't take much to see that you can very quickly get to the point where you wonder what the point of sharing your knowledge, your experiences is, if it has that kind of a negative outcome. And taken together, they're described as epistemic silencing. So we get to the position where, even though it looks pretty obvious, and we all kind of sense there's an elephant in the room, no one feels like they're able to articulate that or do something about that, at least in the individual interaction. I mean, I'm sure, as all of you know by now, there's a new mental health bill that's just been through select committee. it's very clear that as a whole of society, we've overcome the silencing, but certainly on a one-to-one basis, day by day, the moral risk is that that epistemic silencing continues. And of course, it's made worse by a number of myths. And what these myths do is they reinforce the silencing, they justify it. And these are some of the myths that occur in our domain. So, patients in mental distress don't have capacity. We know that that is untrue. And in fact, in the structure of the act itself, it chooses to ignore capacity completely. I mean, at one end in particular, so if we think about people who are psychotic, who have psychosis, there's good research to show us that 4 out of 5 people who are psychotic with psychosis have the capacity to make choices about treatment. A common misconception is that's not the case. Another myth that occurs is that patients are somehow thankful for coercive interventions. They're thankful for being detained under the Mental Health Act, even though ipso facto they have to not want to be detained at the point that they are detained, because if they were happy to get treatment, they'd have it informally. And again, there's a lot of mostly qualitative research that shows that this is in fact untrue. The commonest themes that come out of that research are talking about being dehumanized, or talking about losing dignity. There is some themes, they're usually minor themes, about things like protection and safety, but not usually thanks. In epistemic terms, there's a literature about epistemic paternalism and how that might be justified. And indeed, there's been some discussion in the literature about whether some of the epistemic injustices here might be okay, counterbalanced by a form of paternalism, but I'm not sure there's a lot to be gained by talking about that in any great detail here. But if you're interested, you could go and have a look at epistemic paternalism. So Stoffers is the author who writes a lot about that. The third kind of view here is it's sort of okay, if you like, to minimize these patient views or ignore them or not hear them or downgrade their epistemic value because they're essentially non-normative, right? They don't work, and if society valued all views equally, we'd have a society that doesn't work. You can look overseas to sort of suggest that that possibly has a feeling of truth to it. The difficulty in the mental health space is that many of us experience mental distress from time to time. Depending on exactly who you read, there'll be as many as 1 in 4 New Zealanders will have an episode of mental distress, throughout their lives, and 1 in 10 of us every year will have an episode of mental distress for which intervention provides value. And so that's a pretty huge slice of society if we're going to minimise and say it's not normative, and so we can essentially downgrade or ignore their knowledge. Another myth here is that mental health legislation saves lives. Stops suicide will be what you're all thinking, but in other ways saves lives, maybe prevents homicide. And the literature is very clear here. It doesn't do that. So mental health legislation does not act to prevent these things. And if you doubt me, I'd encourage you to go and look at when mental health legislation has been changed in New Zealand over the last 100 years and look at for example, our suicide rates. And you'll see there is absolutely no difference in our suicide rates by mental health legislation. They're simply non-correlated. And there's plenty of other ways you can examine that problem, but it's simply not true. Mental health legislation does not save lives. And also there's this argument, well, we hardly ever use it. It's in rare cases. You might be right, and this might be some clever chin rubbing, Giles, but it doesn't really matter. And again, as I've seen in another talk I've given, that's not true. Many people are detained under mental health legislation at any one point in time. And so over the course of, life, many people will have an experience or interaction that may lead to interaction with mental health legislation. So the idea of kind of a normative argument of rarity doesn't really hold up. So what does all of this mean from a kind of a moral epistemic perspective? Well, as far as I can come to, and I've spent a long time thinking about this, there can't be mental health legislation which is not epistemically unjust in a structural fashion. And that's very problematic. It's a problem which one jurisdiction in the world, Northern Ireland, has recognised, and so they've abolished mental health legislation and developed capacity legislation that applies across all of health. And that avoids the problem of stereotyping a particular group, people with mental health problems, although it is very difficult to see how that might happen in other places. And for those of you who have had a look at the new mental health bill, some of these issues I think have been recognised because there's a much clearer desire for that new bill to be capacity based, although I'd argue that it probably isn't going to function like that. And so there's some things that you might want to think about when you think about the Mental Health Act and the new Mental Health Bill and how those apply in the doctor-patient relationship, interaction, when the Act is being used, and what that might mean, in terms of ethics and, as I've described here, epistemology, the sharing of knowledge. And so I think this stuff is interesting to think about, but I do think there's some really useful things that you can take home in your future practice, whatever that might be, to think about. And so the first one is awareness. Just be aware of this, right? Be aware of the knowledge we all share and recognize its relative importance. I think it's also useful to be aware of the social role of testamentary epistemic injustice. And what that does is it helps you to overcome it. So by seeing it, you can work on minimizing it. I mean, my personal view is you can't abolish it with the mental health legislation that we have. It's not clear to me if we will be able to overcome this completely if our mental health bill becomes an act as is currently written. But at least if you're aware, you can look in, and you can look in on the dyadic relationships, and you can look out on the social mechanisms of view. It also helps you to think about, are these other epistemic problems occurring, particularly smothering, silencing? Are patients avoiding sharing knowledge for fear of a bad outcome or sort of a resignation about it? And if that's happening, just don't engage with it. It's almost too late now, but I'd encourage you all for thinking hard about mental health legislation and what that might mean, getting involved in it, even early in your career, like now. So I hope that's been helpful.